They used my silence against me.
What? No one did that.
We were worried about
You
you.
didn't know.
Silence has a strange power. Sometimes it protects people. Sometimes it exposes them. But most of the time, silence becomes whatever others decide it means. In my family, silence meant guilt. At least, that was the story they told everyone. The day everything changed began with a phone call that arrived late in the afternoon. The kind of call that carries bad news before a single word is spoken. By the time the sun disappeared behind the buildings outside my office window, the truth had already settled into my chest like a weight that refused to move. My father was gone. The days that followed felt unreal, like walking through someone else's memories instead of my own. The funeral passed in a blur of quiet condolences and heavy glances. People whispered in corners. Old relatives I barely remembered, offering sympathy that felt strangely distant. But something else was happening behind those whispers, something colder, something deliberate. At first I didn't notice it. Grief has a way of blurring details, but slowly patterns began to appear. Conversations stopped when I entered rooms. Quiets followed me longer than necessary. Some relatives avoided me entirely, while others watched with expressions that carried something deeper than sympathy. Suspicion. The shift was subtle at first, like a rumor still trying to find its shape. Then the story began spreading, according to my uncle. The problems started months before my father died. According to my cousin, money had disappeared from one of his accounts. According to my aunt, there had been tension between my father and me that no one else understood. Each version of the story sounded slightly different, but they all shared one common detail: me, somehow. Without ever speaking about it directly, they had built a narrative that placed me at the center of everything that had gone wrong. The strange part was how carefully they avoided saying it to my face. No accusations, no confrontations, just whispers. Whispers that slowly grew louder, and I said nothing. At first, my silence came from shock. Losing my father had already taken everything out of me. The idea that my own family would twist that grief into suspicion felt too absurd to fight. So I stayed quiet. But in families like mine, silence doesn't remain neutral for long. Silence becomes confirmation. Days turned into weeks, and the story grew stronger with each retelling. I began noticing how people looked at me during family gatherings. Conversations stopped when I approached, though some relatives barely acknowledged my presence anymore. They believed the version of events they had been given. Or maybe they simply preferred it because believing the quiet one was guilty meant they didn't have to ask harder questions. My uncle quickly positioned himself as the person managing my father's affairs, the house, the accounts, the paperwork. Everyone seemed comfortable letting him take control. After all, someone had to step in, and according to the story spreading through the family, I had already proven I couldn't be trusted still. I said nothing, but silence doesn't mean blindness. While everyone assumed I was withdrawing from the situation, something else was happening quietly in the background. I was watching, listening, remembering, Little details began connecting in ways they hadn't before. The missing money my uncle mentioned had supposedly vanished months earlier. Yet, I clearly remembered helping my father review those accounts, just weeks before his death. Nothing had been missing then. Another story claimed my father had been arguing with me about finances, but the last conversation we shared told a completely different story. A calm discussion about paperwork he wanted organized. Documents he asked me to keep copies of, important documents. At the time, I didn't think much about them. Now they felt different. One evening, while going through a box of files my father had given me months earlier. I began to understand why he insisted I keep them safe. Bank records, property, documents, account, transfers, everything neatly organized with dates and signatures. The more I looked, the clearer something became. The story my family was telling didn't match the records, not even close. And suddenly, my silence wasn't about grief anymore. It became something else. Strategy. Because confronting them too early would only strengthen their version of the story. They had already spent weeks shaping the narrative. Arguing against it now would simply make me look defensive. Exactly what they expected, so I did. Never imagined I would do. I kept listening. Every accusation whispered behind my back revealed another piece of information. Every assumption they made showed me how but confident they felt about their version of the truth. They believed I was too quiet to fight back, too passive to question them, too broken by grief to notice what they were doing. That belief became their greatest mistake, because while they were busy rewriting the story of what happened to my father's money, I was quietly collecting the real story, and the more evidence I gathered, the more disturbing the truth became. The missing money wasn't missing at all. It had simply moved into accounts connected to someone else in the family, who had been very vocal about my supposed guilt, who had taken control of my father's finances immediately after his death. Someone who had been telling everyone exactly where the blame should fall. My uncle. The realization settled in slowly, like a shadow stretching across a room. The whispers weren't random. Preparation. He hadn't just taken the money. He had created a story that made sure no one would question him, and my silence had helped him do it. Or at least, that's what he believed. Silence has another side. Silence listens. Silence remembers. And sometimes, silence gathers proof. Late that night, sitting alone with the stack of documents spread across the table, I reached the final page in the folder my father had given me. A page I hadn't noticed before. A page that changed everything, because printed at the bottom of that document was something my uncle clearly never expected anyone to see. A transfer authorization signed only 3 days before my father died. Authorization that revealed exactly where the money had gone and exactly who had taken it. For the first time since the accusations began, a small, quiet realization settled into place. They thought my silence meant weakness. They had no idea it was building a case. And the truth I was uncovering was far bigger than stolen money. My uncle hadn't just lied to the family. He had committed fraud, and the evidence was sitting right in front of me. Once a lie is told enough times, it begins to feel real. That was the strategy my family had unknowingly helped create. By the time a month had passed after my father's funeral, the version of events my uncle had quietly introduced into the family had already hardened into something stronger than rumor. It had become the accepted truth, and like most accepted truths, nobody questioned it anymore. According to them, my father's financial problems had started long before he died. They said he had been under stress, that his accounts were unstable, that someone close to him had taken advantage of his trust. They never said my name directly in those conversations, but they didn't need to. Everyone already knew who the story was pointing toward. The quiet one, the son who rarely argued, the one who never defended himself. Me. At family gatherings, I could feel the shift every time I entered a room. Conversations lowered in volume. Some relatives avoided eye contact completely, while others watched with expressions that felt less like sympathy and more like quiet judgment. They believed what they had been told, or maybe they simply believed what was easiest, because if the quiet son was responsible, then no one had to ask uncomfortable questions about anyone else. And my uncle understood that perfectly. He had stepped into the role of the responsible one almost immediately after my father's death. He handled paperwork, organized the estate, managed the house. Every decision passed through him. Everyone trusted him, after all. He was the one who appeared calm, organized, and concerned about protecting the family. Meanwhile, I became the shadow in the background of every conversation, and I allowed it, because by now, my silence was no longer accidental. It was intentional. Every day that passed gave me more time to understand what had really happened. The documents my father had given me were already raising serious questions, but they weren't enough on their own. Paper records can be explained away, they can be dismissed, but patterns are harder to hide, and patterns were beginning to appear. Everywhere I looked, the first thing I noticed was the timing dot. My uncle had claimed that the missing money disappeared months before my father passed away. According to his version of events, the problem had existed long before anyone realized it. But the bank records in my possession told a completely different story. The large transfers happened only days before my father died, not months, days. And they weren't random withdrawals either. They were carefully structured. Movements between accounts that seemed designed to look ordinary at first glance, except for one detail. Every one of those transfers eventually led to an account connected to my uncle. It wasn't obvious, unless someone followed the entire chain, but once I traced the transactions, step by step, the path became impossible to ignore. The money hadn't vanished, it had simply been redirected, slowly, quietly enough that no one would notice unless they had access to the original records my father had given me. And that's when another thought began forming. Why had my father asked me to keep those documents in the first place? At the time, he had simply said they were important, that he trusted me to keep them safe. I assumed it was just routine paperwork he didn't want lost. Now, it felt like something else entirely. It felt like preparation, almost as if he had known something might happen. The more I thought about it, the more certain I became that my father had seen signs of what was happening long before anyone else did. Maybe he had started asking questions. Maybe those questions made someone nervous. Maybe that was the real reason my uncle moved so quickly after his death, because controlling the story early meant controlling the outcome, and for weeks it had worked perfectly. But there was something my uncle had underestimated. He assumed silence meant ignorance. He believed the quiet son he had always dismissed would simply accept the story being told about him. What he didn't understand was that silence can sometimes be the most patient weapon of all. While the rest of the family accepted his explanation, I began collecting more than just bank records. I started observing behavior. The way my uncle spoke about the situation never changed. His version of events remained almost rehearsed, repeating the same phrases each time the topic came up. People who tell the truth rarely repeat themselves that precisely, but people protecting a lie often do. I also noticed how quickly he discouraged deeper questions. Anytime someone asked about specific numbers or timelines, he would redirect the conversation toward emotions instead of facts. He talked about grief, about family unity, about how painful it was that something like this had happened between relatives, and somehow, those emotional speeches always ended the discussion, because nobody wanted to argue during a time of mourning. But while they were focused on his words, I was focused on something else. The gaps, The missing pieces he avoided mentioning, the timeline he never were explained, and the account transfers that quietly exposed everything. One night, after weeks of reviewing the documents again and again, I decided to visit the bank where my father had managed most of his finances, not to confront anyone, just to ask questions. The building looked the same as it always had, the same quiet lobby, the same polite employees behind the counters. But the answers I received there changed everything, because one detail in those records didn't match my uncle's story at all. The authorization for the final transfer. The document clearly carried my father's signature, but according to the bank's internal verification notes, something unusual had happened during that transaction. The signature had been approved remotely, not in person, which meant someone had submitted the request digitally, using my father's account credentials, and that realization opened an entirely new possibility. If the transfer happened digitally, then there had to be a record of the device used to approve it. Every digital authorization leaves a trace, a location, an IP address, a device identity, information that quietly follows every online transaction, information that the bank had stored in its system. When the manager finally pulled up the authorization, details connected to that transfer, the screen displayed something that made the entire room feel suddenly smaller. The location of the device used to approve the transfer. It wasn't my father's house. It wasn't the hospital where he spent his final days. It wasn't anywhere he could have possibly been. The authorization came from another address entirely, an address that belonged to only one person in the family, my uncle. The silence that followed that discovery felt heavier than any accusation, because now the story they had built around my silence was beginning to collapse under its own weight. The whispers that once pointed toward me were about to point somewhere else entirely, but exposing the truth would require patience, and the moment to reveal it had not arrived yet, because as I left the bank that evening, another realization settled in. The evidence I had collected wasn't just enough to prove my innocence. It was enough to prove something far worse, something that could destroy the reputation my uncle had spent years building within the family, and if I played this carefully, the same silence they used against me would be the very thing that revealed everything. For weeks, the truth sat quietly in a folder on my desk, not because I didn't want to expose it, but because timing matters. When the truth is powerful enough to destroy a lie by now. The story my uncle created had grown deep roots inside the family. Relatives repeated it casually during phone calls. Friends of the family heard versions of it through whispers and half-explanations. Even people outside the family circle had started looking at me differently. A quiet reputation can be rewritten especially when the person being accused refuses to argue. But that was exactly why I waited, because lies that grow naturally when the truth finally pierce, and the more confident my uncle became, the easier it would be to expose him over time. I noticed something interesting happening. The more people accepted the story, the more comfortable my uncle became. His explanations became longer, more detailed, almost theatrical at times. He spoke with the calm confidence of someone who believed the situation was completely under control. That confidence made him careless. He started discussing the missing money more openly during family gatherings. He talked about responsibility, about protecting the family from financial damage, about how difficult it had been to handle the situation after my father passed away. Each speech made him sound more like a hero. One who protected the family from someone who had supposedly betrayed them, and I listened, enjoyed hearing it. Every word gave me another opportunity to study, how deeply the lie had taken hold. It also helped me understand what's something important. Everyone, quiet explanations wouldn't work. Private conversations wouldn't be enough. If the lie had been built publicly, then the truth would need to appear the same way. Fortunately, the perfect opportunity arrived sooner than expected. 2 months after my father's death, my uncle announced that the family should gather at the house to discuss the final distribution of my father's assets. According to him, it was time to settle everything officially. Everyone was invited: cousins, aunts, distant relatives who had suddenly become interested in the situation, the entire family. The moment I heard about the meeting, I realized something. My uncle believed he had already won. He thought the story he created was strong enough that no one would question him anymore. He believed my silence had confirmed everything he said. He was about to learn what silence really meant. The day of the gathering arrived. Quietly, the house looked exactly the same as it had during countless family visits over the years. The same living room, the same photographs on the walls, the same dining table where family celebrations once happened. But the atmosphere inside felt completely different. People sat in small groups, speaking quietly to one another. Some glanced at me occasionally, their expressions uncertain. Others avoided looking at me entirely. By now, I was used to it. My uncle stood near the center of the room, speaking with the calm authority he had grown comfortable with. Papers were spread across the table in front of him, neatly organized. Presentation. He looked confident, relaxed, certain that everything was about to go exactly as he planned. The meeting began slowly. Relatives gathered around the table while my uncle explained the situation again. He repeated the same narrative he had been sharing for weeks: my father's financial troubles, the missing money, the damage caused by someone who had supposedly betrayed his trust, even without saying my name directly. The implication filled the room like a shadow, and still I said nothing. The longer he spoke, the more comfortable he became. His voice carried the tone of someone delivering a final explanation, tying together all the loose ends before closing a painful chapter. At one point, he even expressed disappointment about how the situation had divided the family, a carefully performed sadness. But while everyone listened to his version of the story, something else was happening quietly. I was watching their reactions. Some relatives looked convinced, others looked uncertain, a few appeared uncomfortable, as if part of them suspected something wasn't quite right, but I couldn't explain why. And then my uncle reached the final part of his explanation: distribution of the remaining assets. He began discussing how the family would move forward now that everything had been settled, how certain financial adjustments needed to be made, how the estate would be reorganized to protect what remained. It was a convincing performance, right up until the moment it ended, because just as he finished speaking, I finally did something that surprised everyone in the room. I stood up. The movement alone drew every pair of eyes toward me. The quiet son who had remained silent for weeks was suddenly stepping forward. For a moment, nobody spoke, not even my uncle. Slowly, I walked toward the table where the documents were spread out. The same calm silence that had followed me for weeks now filled the room with a completely different kind of tension. Then I placed my own folder on the table. Touching wood echoed louder than expected in the quiet room. The folder opened slowly. Inside were the records I had spent weeks studying: bank statements, transfer authorizations, verification reports. Every document arranged in perfect order. At first, nobody understood what they were looking at, but curiosity quickly replaced confusion. One of my cousins leaned closer to the table than another. Within seconds, several people were studying the papers, and that's when the room changed. The realization didn't arrive all at once, spread slowly across their faces as they followed the chain of transactions printed on the pages, the dates, the amounts, the account numbers. The same money my uncle claimed had disappeared months earlier, except the records showed exactly where it had gone and exactly when. Final page revealed the detail that mattered most: the digital authorization log connected to the transfer, the location of the device used to approve it, an address tied directly to my uncle. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything that had happened before. No one needed to explain what the documents meant. Across every page, the story everyone believed began to collapse. People looked up from the papers, their eyes moved from the documents to my uncle, and suddenly, the man who had controlled the story for weeks no longer looked confident, because the same silence he used against me was now surrounding him, and this time, the silence wasn't protecting him, it was waiting for the truth. There is a moment when a lie finally realizes it has nowhere left to hide. That moment had arrived. The room felt completely different now. Only minutes earlier, it had been filled with quiet acceptance, with people nodding along to a story they believed was already settled. Now the same room felt heavy with uncertainty that the papers spread across the table had changed everything. Family members stared at the documents again and again, as if expecting the numbers to rearrange themselves into something less disturbing. But the facts were simple, and facts have a stubborn way of refusing to change. The transfers were real. The dates were clear. And the digital authorization traced back to a location no one in the room could ignore. My uncle's house spent weeks convincing everyone that someone else had stolen the money, the same man who had quietly allowed suspicion to fall on me, while presenting himself as the responsible one, holding the family together. Now, the silence that once protected him had turned into something much colder. Excitation. People slowly looked up from the documents. Their eyes moved across the room until they reached the person who hadn't spoken since the papers appeared. On the table, my uncle, for the first time since my father's death, his calm confidence had disappeared. The rehearsed authority that once filled his voice had been replaced by something far less controlled: panic. It was subtle at first, a shift in posture, a hesitation in his breathing. His eyes moved quickly from one relative to another, searching for someone who might still believe his version of the story. But belief is fragile when confronted with proof, and the proof was sitting right in front of them. Someone picked up one of the documents again, tracing the chain of transactions printed across the page. Another relative leaned closer to read the verification report attached to the final transfer. The room filled with quiet realization. The numbers told a very different story from the one they had been hearing for weeks. The money hadn't vanished months earlier. It had moved days before my father died. It hadn't disappeared. It had been redirected. Carefully. Deliberately. And the person who authorized the transfer had used a digital device connected to only one address: my uncle's. For a long moment, no one spoke, not because they didn't understand what the documents meant, but because understanding something and accepting it are two very different things. The family had spent weeks believing one version of events. They had allowed that version to shape their opinions, their conversations, and their judgments. Now they were facing the uncomfortable realization that they had been listening to the wrong person all along. Slowly, the attention in the room shifted. It moved away from me and toward him, the man who had guided every conversation since my father's funeral, the one who presented himself as the protector of the family. The silence that surrounded him now felt different. It wasn't supportive. It was demanding answers for the first time. My uncle looked completely unprepared. The careful explanations he had repeated for weeks no longer worked in the presence of written proof. The emotional speeches he used to redirect conversations suddenly felt empty against the clear evidence printed across those pages. The story he had built so carefully was collapsing piece by piece, and everyone in the room could see it happening. One relative slowly placed the documents back on the table. Another stepped away from my uncle, as if distance might somehow make the situation easier to understand. Faces that once carried quiet suspicion, anything else entirely. Regret, because they were beginning to realize how easily narrative had been shaped, how quickly they had accepted the whispers, how willingly they had allowed silence to become evidence of guilt. Silence was never guilt. Patience, silence was observation, and sometimes silence was preparation for weeks. They had assumed my quietness meant weakness. Now, they were learning that silence can hold something far more powerful. Truth. The weight of that realization settled heavily across the room. No dramatic confrontation was necessary. No raised voices or angry arguments followed. The documents had already said everything that needed to be said. Proof has a way of ending debates quickly. Eventually, someone gathered the papers again, reading the final page carefully. The authorization record. The digital trace. The location data. Every detail pointing to the same conclusion. And with that realization, there came something else, the understanding that the situation was bigger than family disagreements, because what those records described wasn't just dishonesty, it was fraud. Deception. Accounts accessed without proper authority, a story deliberately crafted to hide the truth. Of that truth extended far beyond the walls of the house, and everyone in the room understood it. My uncle understood it too. The confidence that once surrounded him had vanished completely. His shoulders seemed smaller now, his presence less certain. The silence he once used as a weapon had turned against him. But the strange thing about that moment was what I felt: not anger, not triumph, just clarity. For weeks, I had watched the story about me grow stronger. I had heard relatives repeat accusations without questioning them. I had seen how easily silence could be twisted into guilt. When people wanted simple answers, reached its ending voice to defend it, it had already spoken through the records. I gathered the documents from the table and placed them back into the folder where they had waited patiently for weeks. The room remained quiet as I did. No one tried to stop me. No one argued, because everyone understood that the story they believed in had just been rewritten. What quiet son they once suspected was never the problem. The real betrayal had been standing in front of them the entire time, and suddenly, the silence that followed felt completely different from the silence before. This silence wasn't suspicion, understanding. I walked toward the door without saying a word. No explanation was necessary anymore. Behind me, the family remained in the living room, still processing what they had just learned. The documents had revealed more than stolen money. They had revealed how easily people can be manipulated when someone controls the narrative, and How dangerous assumptions can become misunderstood. The air felt lighter. The story that once trapped me inside had finally reached its end. They had used my. It meant weakness, but silence can do something far more powerful than defend itself. Silence can collect the truth, and when the truth finally appears, it doesn't need to shout.